Hello, and welcome to the next part of our Chapter a Day series going through the book of Genesis. Today we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 16. If you've been following along with us, we know that in the last chapter, in chapter 15, we had this very powerful moment where God once again states the covenant promise that he's made with Abram. And when Abram asks him how he can know for sure this is true, we have this incredible picture where God himself enters into a covenant-making ceremony common in the ancient Near East, where we have the picture of the animals that are slaughtered, their bodies spread apart, their blood flowing out to make a path of blood, which the two covenanting parties would pass through this path, and thereby declaring that they would rather die, that they would rather have happened to them what had happened to the sacrificed animals than to break faith with the other party. And so God tells Abram to perform this ritual, to prepare this path of blood. And then God takes time and explains to Abram what the future is going to look like for his descendants over the next period of time. And then we see this theophany, this image of God that travels down the path of blood. So the Lord himself is declaring that he will keep his promise, that he would rather cease to exist than break the covenant promise he's made with Abram. But then we also noted that unlike the usual practice in the ancient Near East, where both parties would have to make the covenant promise, only the Lord makes the promise. Because only the Lord has the power to keep the covenant. Abram is a spectator to the promise that's being made. In that moment, there was a great deal of excitement seeing what Abram has to trust in, because he'd been wrestling about the fact that he didn't have an heir, and how the Lord promised him that he would have his own son that would begin this progression to becoming a great nation. But now we find ourselves in chapter 16. So let's enter into the text. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. And this we know from one of the very first encounters we have. Actually, the very first mention of Sarai that we see, we are told that Sarai is barren. So that is the physical reality. She has never been able to produce children. This is the physical reality that impacts everything that God has promised to happen. So we see in the text, continuing to read, she had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. In all likelihood, Hagar, we're told, an Egyptian servant, probably acquired when Abram went down to Egypt with Sarai and said, tell people that I'm your brother and that we're brother and sister. Don't let them know that I'm your husband, lest they kill me. And we're told that Pharaoh rewarded Abram, gave him basically a bride price for Sarai, and that included livestock and servants. So it's quite likely that Hagar may have come into their household because of Abram's self-preservation act. Anyway, she serves Sarai. In verse 2, and Sarai said to Abram, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant, that it may be that I shall obtain children by her. The language here is interesting. So we have Sarai, who has no children. She has a female servant, Hagar, an Egyptian. And Sarai makes this statement. She says, "The Lord has prevented me." So I haven't had children, Abram, because the Lord has prevented me from having children. So the same Lord who's made a promise to you about having a great nation, that same Lord has prevented me from having children. That's quite a statement. On one side, it recognizes God's sovereign hand. The other side, it would appear that she's making an accusation to the Lord. She's saying, the Lord that you're trusting, the Lord that you're excited about in his promise, well, that's the same Lord that has kept me from having children. So this is what we're going to do. In order for you to have the promise, you need an heir. You need a son. So this is what we'll do. So Sarai falls back on traditional custom. She says, "My servant, she's my property, therefore I can permit you to have sexual relations with her and any children she has, because she is my property. Those children are also my property. So it will be your son and me." So I, as the owner of the woman who has the child, that's my connection to the child, and you would be the father. There we go. This is how we're going to deal with this. Because the Lord has prevented me from having children, and you need a child to fulfill the promise, this is how we're going to make it work. This is what we do. This is the man-made solution. So many times we can encounter situations in life where the Lord has already promised us how he's going to work it out. But we need to trust him, and we need to wait on him, and we need to follow him. And yet instead we go to man-made customs. Well, how does this work in the world? How can we accomplish this in the world? Well, in the world they would do this. So then we do it. We adopt it. We who have been given a promise, we adopt the world's ways. So that's what Sarai proposes. And let's see where Abram's faith lies. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." So we come to an interesting situation here. This is what happens when we don't depend on the Lord to accomplish his promise, and we seek to use man-made custom in order to accomplish what we think is necessary for the Lord's promise to come to be. So we have Sarai and Hagar. Sarai gives Hagar to Abram. She is conceiving. So she's pregnant now. And we have this So we have Abram here. Now that Hagar is expecting a child, now that she's conceived, now Hagar sees her value in this community. Because she goes, well, Sarai could not provide an heir for Abram, and everything that Abram's concerned about is based on the promise. In all likelihood, the whole community is aware of the promise. So she begins to say, well, now I have a greater value than Sarai because I have provided what Abram needs. I am going to have a child. I am going to provide an heir. So she begins to get in conflict with Sarai. Sarai in conflict with Hagar, which then causes Sarai to get in conflict with Abram. So you see what happens when we depend on man-made custom. Instead of it leading to peace, it leads to conflict. Because now Hagar sees her position has changed because of what she and Abram have done together. Now she sees herself as elevated above Sarai. Sarai is resentful both of the fact that Hagar is now expecting a child and is resentful of Hagar's feeling of an elevated position. So Sarai now attacks Abram. Sarai was the one who proposed this man-made solution. And now we see that she is upset. She goes, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave you my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me," saying, may the Lord take my side in this. The irony of it is that all of them are acting outside the promise. Abram is acting outside the promise. He should have said to her, no, we're going to wait on the Lord. He's going to fulfill his promise. Sarai should have trusted in the promise. So both of them are in conflict, but they're both acting outside the promise. So then we see the solution. But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Abram, in effect, denies responsibility. He wants the heir. He wants the promise. He acted in a man-made fashion to try to accomplish it. Now it has resulted in conflict, and Abram denies responsibility. He basically says, she's your problem. You own her. She's your servant. Do whatever you want. Instead of taking responsibility in his household. We've seen some very positive character traits developing in Abram. In this side, we see a very familiar human character trait, that resistance to responsibility. He fails to be who he should be in his household and as the one holding the promise that God has made. And then we see a picture into Sarai and see her humanness. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. Abram trusting in man-made custom. Abram putting himself in a situation where now there is conflict. Now there are two wives. Abram denying his responsibility. Sarai angry that Hagar is conceived and she is not. Angry that Hagar sees herself now as more valuable in the household than she is. Then turns on Hagar, using her position in the household to make life absolutely miserable for Hagar. And so Hagar has no choice. Hagar runs away. And we see this and we see the conflict and we see the people. And one of the things I want us to notice and always remember when we're reading the Word of God is the Word of God is a real story about a real God interacting with real people. Abram is not a hero who travels through his journey without flaws. Sarai is not a hero who travels through her journey without flaws. They are real people, and we see in them real character traits common to humanity everywhere. We see the presence of a sin nature. A sin nature that trusts in its own methods rather than relying solely on God. We see a sin nature that denies responsibility, that heads into conflict. These are things that we're all familiar with because this is part of our nature. This is part of our struggle. This is something that we need redemption from. And we see it being acted out here with this person who God has given great promise to. So Hagar, in the midst of all this, runs away. Verse 7. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, son of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing my mistress Sarai. Now I want you to notice certain things here in this narrative. Hagar's running. She's running from Sarai. She doesn't know where she's going to go. She's a stranger in a strange land. She's a servant. She has no resource. She has nothing to help her or support her. So she's running. And she is met by the angel of the Lord. This is an interesting figure that we encounter time by time in the Old Testament. Often we view this character to actually be a Christophany, a pre-incarnation appearance of Jesus Christ. We think of that here in the midst of this mess surrounding the promise, here is this woman who is pregnant with a child running into the wilderness, and Jesus meets her there. And as he so often does when we see him in his time on earth as a man, he speaks to her and asks her questions to help her understand where she is. First of all, he knows her name. He knows her name. In the midst of her loneliness and fear and struggle, there is one who knows her name. Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarah. That's where she's coming from. She has no answer as to where she's going, because she doesn't know. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring, so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. What a picture that we have here. Because you see, as Abram and Sarai acted outside of the promise, and in acting outside of the promise and working in man-made ways, they've drawn in this servant into their act, which is an act of disobedience based on the statement that the Lord has prevented the promise from taking place. We have Hagar receiving a promise. It's not the same promise that was given to Abram, but it's a promise to her in the midst of her affliction. The angel of the Lord says, go back to Sarai and submit. That's your role. But know this as you go back, that you are also going to have a son. He will also be a nation, a strong nation. And you're going to call him Ishmael. And Ishmael literally means God hears. God hears. For this woman, in the midst of all that's going on, the Lord of glory cares for her. I know your name. I know where you come from. I know you don't know where you're going. So this is what I want you to do. I want you to submit and go back to the place where you were from. But know this, you have been used for other people's man-made purposes, trying to accomplish my promise outside of my power. But I'm going to give you a promise. I'm going to give you a son. He is also going to be a nation. He will be a strong nation. You are going to call him God hears. Because in the point of your affliction, I heard you. I know what happened. Verse 13. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God of seeing. The God who sees me. For she said, truly, here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Ber Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son. And Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. And in this story we have another unveiling of the character of God. We have the God who hears and the God who sees me. The God who hears. Remember that. As you think about the God that is being unveiled page by page as we read through the book of Genesis, we have the God who is the creator. We have the God who is the covenant keeper. We have the God who hears. The God who sees me. The God who hears. Hears our cry. Hears our desperation. Hears when we call out in the day of trouble. And we have the God who sees me where I really am, sees me in my broken, sinful condition, sees me there and provides a way of salvation through Jesus Christ. The promise will be fulfilled. It won't be fulfilled through this means. It won't be fulfilled through something that leads to conflict, something that causes one to deny responsibility. It'll be fulfilled through the work of God, through the one who keeps his promise, to the one who knows our name, to the one who hears and the one who sees. I hope that you can dwell on that today. I hope it's an encouragement to you. You think about the God who meets a terrified woman with nowhere to go, coming from calamity, meets her where she is, hears her cry, sees her in her brokenness, and gives her a promise. We're going to continue on and see how God is going to take this product of a sin nature and how he is going to continue to bring the promise to fruition through his power, through his word. I hope this has been an encouragement to you. As always, we'd love to hear from you, any feedback or comments you have. And please, if this blesses you, encourages you, challenges you, share it with somebody else so it can bless them too. Thank you, and the Lord bless you.